Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling a seriously high-yield clinical focus straight out of Lecture-4. We're looking at the comprehensive management and treatment strategies for acute renal failure. So if you want to absolutely ace this classic 10-mark exam question and get a crystal clear breakdown of how to practically approach and manage the failing kidney, well, you are in exactly the right place. Let's get into it. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. Decoding acute renal failure. 2. Managing pre-renal AKI. 3. Treating intrinsic renal failure. 4. Resolving post-renal obstructions. And finally, 5. The absolute indications for dialysis. Section 1, Decoding Acute Renal Failure. Let's define exactly what we're looking at. So acute kidney injury, which honestly a lot of people still refer to as acute renal failure, is defined as an abrupt deterioration of kidney function. We're talking about a sudden drop that happens over a period of days or sometimes a few weeks. The hallmark here is that this deterioration is severe enough to result in the retention of nitrogenous wastes in the blood, specifically urea and creatinine. And this is usually accompanied with oliguria, which is a really significant drop in urine output. You have to remember, this retention of waste, it's a true medical emergency. It produces these sudden, life-threatening biochemical disturbances that require rapid categorization and immediate aggressive management. Moving right along to Section 2, Managing Pre-renal AKI. It's all about managing perfusion. Pre-renal azotemia is actually the most common form of AKI you're going to see, and it happens simply because of inadequate renal plasma flow. The beautiful thing about pre-renal AKI, though, is that there is usually no parenchymal damage to the kidney itself. That means it is rapidly reversible once you restore that blood flow. So what's our clinical flowchart here? Step 1, meticulously assess the patient's volume status. Step 2, optimize systemic and renal hemodynamics. This basically means giving crystalloid fluids or, packed red blood cells if they're actively bleeding. Step 3, eliminate nephrotoxic agents. You absolutely must stop drugs that mess with renal autoregulation. That means cutting out NSAIDs, which prevent afferent vasodilation, or ACE inhibitors and ARBs, which prevent efferent vasoconstriction. So the crucial point to take away here is that your fluid management strategy is entirely dictated by the patient's specific presentation, and it can be completely opposite from one patient to the next. If your patient is in a hypovolemic state, maybe from a severe hemorrhage or really severe dehydration, you treat them aggressively with buffered crystalloid solutions or packed red blood cells to restore that effective circulating volume. But if the patient is in a fluid overloaded state, say from decompensated heart failure, giving them more fluid would be literally disastrous. In that scenario, you do the exact opposite. You treat with high-dose loop diuretics like furosemide to reduce the congestion and improve cardiac output, which in turn improves renal perfusion. Section 3, Treating intrinsic renal failure. Now we are looking inside the kidney itself. Now, what's really interesting here is how the management of intrinsic AKI is highly specific to the underlying cellular damage. There's absolutely no one-size-fits-all approach. Take acute tubular necrosis, or ATN, for example. It's the most common cause of intrinsic acute renal failure, yet there is actually no specific therapy for it other than restoring renal perfusion and providing meticulous supportive care while you wait for the tubules to regenerate. But look at rhabdomyolysis. For this, you need early, aggressive IV fluids. We're talking sometimes up to 10 liters a day. And you might even consider alkaline diuresis to prevent cast formation. For immune-mediated conditions like glomerulonephritis, you completely pivot to immunosuppressive drugs, steroids, or plasmapheresis. And then for tumor lysis syndrome, it's aggressive fluids right alongside allopurinol or rasburicase. The treatment absolutely must match the specific pathology. Let's look at another intrinsic cause, acute interstitial nephritis, or AIN, which is very often triggered by medications. The very first and honestly most critical step in the clinical pathway is to withdraw the offending agent. Just stop the drug. Then you provide supportive care and close observation. If the patient shows no improvement within a week, or if you're seeing rapid progression, well, that's when you escalate. For classic allergic AIN, you'd move to corticosteroids. If it's refractory or atypical, you might actually need a renal biopsy and potentially much stronger immunosuppressive drugs. It's a very logical, stepped approach based entirely on their clinical response. Okay, Section 4, Resolving Post-renal Obstructions. This is where we fix the blockage. Post-renal AKI is basically a plumbing problem. It's all about an obstruction to the flow of urine, which creates this intense back pressure that physically stops glomerular filtration. This obstruction can happen literally anywhere, from the renal pelvis all the way down to the tip of the urethra. You could have stones, blood clots, or tumors blocking the ureters. Further down the line, you could be dealing with an enlarged prostate, cervical cancer, or even just a simple obstructed Foley catheter that's blocking the bladder outlet. And because this is a mechanical problem, it requires a mechanical solution. The ultimate goal is the urgent relief of the obstruction. Depending on exactly where the block is located, this might involve a simple transurethral or suprapubic bladder catheterization. If the block is higher up, urologists might need to go in and place a ureteral stent or perform a percutaneous nephrostomy tube placement directly into the kidney itself. Prompt recognition and these specific mechanical interventions are absolutely critical because they forestall the permanent structural damage to the kidney that happens from prolonged urinary stasis. Finally, Section 5, Absolute Indications for Dialysis. Knowing exactly when to initiate renal replacement therapy. So, here we arrive at the million-dollar clinical question. When do our conservative measures fail? At what specific point do the life-threatening complications of acute renal failure mandate that we step in with mechanical filtration, otherwise known as renal replacement therapy? Well, here are your non-negotiable red flags. These are the absolute indications where dialysis is no longer just an option, it is quite literally life-saving. They include fluid overload and pulmonary edema that are completely refractory to diuretics, severe metabolic acidosis, resistant hyperkalemia that simply won't budge with medical therapy, Severe uremic complications, like when the toxins build up so high they actually cause pericarditis or uremic encephalopathy. Severe hyperphosphatemia or specific toxic drug ingestions, think lithium or severe aspirin overdose. And finally, prolonged anuria. Let's break down a few of the critical thresholds for these numbers because they are super important. 7.1. This is the critical threshold for your patient's blood pH. Severe metabolic acidosis with a pH of less than 7.1 means the body is essentially drowning in acid. The kidneys have entirely lost their ability to buffer or excrete it, and standard medical therapies like sodium bicarbonate are completely failing. At this point, you must initiate dialysis to correct that acid-base balance. 6.5. This represents a serum potassium level greater than 6.5 milliequivalents per liter. Hyperkalemia is incredibly dangerous. When potassium hits this level and is resistant to dietary control and medical interventions like insulin and glucose, and especially if you are seeing cardiac conduction defects or ECG changes like broad QRS complexes, this is an immediate emergency trigger. Dialysis is absolutely required to pull that potassium out of the blood before it causes a fatal arrhythmia. 12. This stands for 12 hours. If a patient experiences anuria, meaning they're producing zero or near zero urine, and that persists for more than 12 hours, it is a definitive marker of failed renal excretory function. In the context of AKI, persistent anuria means those complications we just talked about, like fluid overload and hyperkalemia, simply will not resolve on their own. You need mechanical support. There is, however, a very delicate balance to strike here. A major guiding clinical principle is that the initiation of dialysis should not await the development of a life-threatening complication if you can see it coming. Initiating dialysis too late exposes the patient to avoidable, fatal metabolic complications. But on the flip side, initiating it too early unnecessarily exposes them to the risks of central lines, blood infections, and procedural hypotension. It's tough. Because of this, many specialists will actually initiate dialysis empirically when the blood urea nitrogen exceeds a certain high value, assuming there are no clinical signs of renal recovery, to proactively prevent those life-threatening emergencies before they even happen. We'll wrap up today's explainer with this thought-provoking question. We know for a fact that the kidney possesses this truly remarkable capacity to repair itself, even after a severe dialysis-requiring acute injury. Yet some patients undergo what we call maladaptive repair processes. They fail to recover fully and they remain permanently dependent on dialysis. So what hidden factors drive this? Why does acute kidney injury so often accelerate the progression into chronic kidney disease? Keep that question in the back of your mind because that complex pathophysiology is exactly what we are going to be exploring next time. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and I'll see you in the next explainer.